First of all, I have to apologize. I caught a cold, at least I probably caught a cold a few days ago, but today it decided to declare itself. So I'm not going to be my buoyant self, just a little buoyant. When I was asked to present at this conference, I was asked to talk about orphan drugs. I've gotten a number of orphan indications, so I've been part of the team that's gotten a number of orphan indications on both sides of the Atlantic, and I've gotten a number of help get a number of drugs approved, which have orphan designation. But I'm now deeply involved in global health, and I said, actually, you know, the global health really is the antithesis of orphan indications. And so let me just show that even while it is the antithesis, there are many similarities, and there are certain mechanisms where they do converge. But I thought I'd at least introduce you to the whole world of global health, since this may not be on your radar screen. First of all, prevalence. Over half of humanity is at risk for or currently has a neglected tropical communicable disease. A lot of people. Orphan diseases are rare by definition. Incentives. In global health, there are very few, and they're really of questionable value. The only one that I'm aware of is the FDA neglected disease voucher for 15 neglected tropical diseases, and the only one that's ever been granted actually did not prove its worth. We can talk about this later if you'd like. On the other hand, with orphan diseases, there are a number of vouchers, of incentives. First of all, both the EU and the FDA have decreased fees for scientific advice, at least in Europe. In the US, it's free. Filing fees are either markedly reduced or absent, and there are other advantages to having orphan designation. Prospects for profitability. Well, if you're treating the disease on label, global health, it's small, very small. However, just like our previous speaker showed, that you can, once you have a drug that's approved, you can then repurpose it for something else and perhaps find profitability. And I'll just say parenthetically, Celgene's first approval of any drug was a drug which was approved for lepromatous leprosy, and then we discovered it worked also in multiple myeloma, and that actually has allowed us to grow into a full-fledged pharmaceutical. Orphan diseases, yes. And in fact, I've heard most of the discussion today about pricing and this and that, but it can be profitable. Advocacy. In global health, there is advocacy, but it's mostly done by non-government organizations and governments as well. The EU is a large contributor to global health efforts. However, there's a strong bias for generics and low-cost therapeutics, and there's also an innate distrust of innovative pharmaceutical companies. In fact, about a year ago, we went and visited the people at WHO who deal with global health issues, and they were shocked. It was the first time in years that a pharmaceutical company actually went and visited them. They just weren't used to talking to pharmaceutical companies. With orphan diseases, there's patient advocacy groups, and there's also innate trust of innovative pharmaceutical companies. It's not, I won't say it's a love fest, but there's very good win-win cooperation between the two entities. But I think now let me explain what global health is. So if you'll indulge me for about 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to give you Global Health 101 to understand the world we're living in. Okay, the world is economically heterogeneous. A little less than 10% of people live in high-income settings. And a high-income setting means that you're making more than $12,275 per year per person. That's median gross national product. The remaining group of people either live in middle-income settings, and you can see what the price points are. I'm not going to read it off. And 46% live in low-income settings. 1.4 billion people make nothing at all, nothing you can measure. Now, about 50 million people live in a country in crisis or a setting in crisis, civil war, earthquakes. So you think of Haiti, you think of a number of countries, which you can tell me. And, but these are short-lived, and oftentimes once whatever has upset the society is over, they bounce back very quickly. And the good news is that the world is improving. In fact, more countries, there is a steady migration of people out of low income into middle, and middle into high income, much more so than people moving in the other direction. I can prove this to you. If you go to gapminder.org, which I recommend if you want to learn about global health, and you go back to 1800, you'll find that no country in the world, and you plot life expectancy at birth to per capita income, what you'll find is that no country in the world was the median age greater than 40 years. What that meant was the majority of people were less than 15 years old, and there was high infant mortality and high maternal mortality as well. So if you lived in the absolute best place in the world, lots of luck. If you go to 2011, what you'll find is the worst country in the world has a median income, a median age of greater than 45 years. And by the way, this is Afghanistan, Haiti's over here. So you'll see that the world has improved. You know, in fact, a little statistic I know is when the error bars don't overlap, you've done something. The other thing is that all countries are economically heterogeneous. So you can go to the highest income countries in the world, and you'll find areas of low income settings and moderate income settings. And this homogeneity is the basis for global health. Now, you also have to understand the ecology of global health. It's hard for me to see at this angle, so I'm going to look over here. But basically, with socioeconomic development, you bring better nutrition, housing, increased literacy, safe water and sanitation. And also, this is coupled with cultural and behavioral changes which affect hygiene, use of health services, safe sex, tobacco, alcohol, as well as bring in new technologies. And what happens is there becomes a decline in infectious diseases, as well as mortality, such as maternal, perinatal, and due to malnutrition. This leads to decrease in fertility. Why? Because babies aren't dying very quickly. Women breastfeed longer, and which is a very good form of birth control. Also, you find that the population ages, so more people are making out of their fifth year, and all of a sudden the mean age increases beyond 15 years old. Because people live long enough, there's an increase in non-communicable diseases and injuries. And I'll just say that if you go back to 1800, if you were fortunate to make it to be 30, you would live a much longer life than 30. And by the way, then you'd start developing diseases that we deal with today. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that as the population of the Western world increased, then we started discovering orphan diseases because people lived long enough to declare themselves. And they all were dying of an infectious disease. The last stage is you get to certain non-communicable diseases, but new ones emerge of the very old. Alzheimer's, for example, very bad osteoporosis, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a demographic transition as people are now living longer, more people need work, et cetera, et cetera. And you also find that there's a disease transition. And because of this, now people have chronic diseases, the expense of healthcare increases dramatically. And this is what the whole world is facing right now. I defy you to find a part of the world, anywhere in the world, which is not dealing now with chronic care issues, even the poorest countries in the world. So this is a problem of transition to modernity. You're dealing with, especially in low-income settings and middle-income settings, you're still dealing with the residual illnesses of the poor, of which I summarized a number here. But at the same time, you should probably learn the lessons of the well-to-do and try to avoid obesity and lack of exercise, and so on and so forth. And these are major problems which the whole world is facing. I recently talked to a foreign minister of a Gulf state country, and he said the problem we have now is all our kids are fat and are developing diabetes. And he says, and it's ridiculous, you know. He says, I go out, I used to work hard, I'm thin, and now they're not. They're just eating. Let's get back to global health. Poverty is a social disease. And so let's first of all, what health is. Health is defined by WHO and the World Bank, by the way, that health permits a socially and economically productive life. So if you have something that prevents you from being socially or economically productive, you're not healthy. And poverty inhibits both and hence causes ill health. And you have to look at poverty as the issue, not the diseases they have. They're symptoms of poverty. Now, we've talked about this in this conference, but we haven't articulated it. And actually, here we go. I just wanted to emphasize that. There we go. There's something called the DALY, or Disability-Associated Life Year. And what that is the number of years lost due to illness, disability, or early death. So when I was born, if I was supposed, my median group of males born in my location was supposed to live to the age of 70. And I was hit by a bus when I was 20. I lost 50 years. If on the other hand, and I died. On the other hand, if I was hit by a bus and I spent the rest of my time in a wheelchair and wasn't able to work again, I also lost 50 years. And so what the World Bank did with WHO's health, they said, they said, okay, let's look at the whole realm of how humans can get injured and figure out the DALYs for every country in the whole world, which they've done. You can go online and find it. There are three ways you can get a DALY. You can get a communicable disease, you can get a non-communicable disease, or you can get injured. That's it. And there are hundreds of reasons under this. And what you find is that that when you shake out all the problems for DALYs on a worldwide basis, certain things fall out and it becomes very enlightening if you want to prioritize things. And I'll get to that in 1 second. But a very important point is that in 1998 was the last time in human history, hopefully never again, that communicable diseases were the major cause of death in the world. About 60% of all deaths in the world this year will be due to non-communicable diseases. And because of this, in September, the UN declared a new initiative for non-communicable diseases in low-income countries. And they're addressing obesity, heart disease, pulmonary disease, and I think psychiatric disease. I have to look it up. And diabetes. So let's go back to disease of the developing world, or as it's called in this community, DDW. So the complications of poverty. And when you treat DDW, you're treating a poverty symptom. But it's been shown now that if you treat, such treatment allows people to become economically productive and actually pull themselves out of poverty in many instances. So, what are the neglected tropical diseases? There are 13 or 14 of them which are quite prevalent. In total, there's approximately 30. I could be wrong, 31, 29, whatever. Most of them are in the developing countries. Although I'll just tell you that this year in Europe, there'll be cases of malaria in both Italy and Greece, global warming. And there's also leishmaniasis found in dogs. As long as humankind existed, there probably have been these diseases. And they disproportionately affect the world's poorest people, mostly subsistence farmers and urban slum dwellers. They cause morbidity and disability, but the mortality is not as prevalent as the big three, and I'll get to that in a second. And they promote poverty. They interfere with economic development. So, let's look at some numbers. If you look at the worm diseases, we're talking about over 1 billion people. With protozoal diseases, again, hundreds of millions of people. Bacterial and viral, many people. Now I didn't get into the big three, but I'll get into the big three in 1 second. This, by the way, is what's called Romagna science due to Chagas disease, which is a parasitic disease for which there is no cure, and eventually will kill this person after about 20 or 30 years of disability. Here's a case of elephantiasis, which is due to lymphatic filariasis. It's believed that about half the world's population is at risk for becoming infected. Now, if you rank all the diseases by dollies, things kind of fall out. Actually, infectious diseases by dolly. The number one dolly in the world is heart disease. Number two, by the way, is depression. But when you get to infectious diseases, you find that that neglected tropical diseases are actually about number 6 if you lump them together, about 56.6 million people. If you look at the big three, only HIV/AIDS has a bigger dolly than malaria and tuberculosis. Now, if you look at death, it's a different story. With HIV/AIDS, I believe a little over 2 million people will die this year. I think with malaria, it's about 800,000, and it's going down. And tuberculosis, it's about 2 million people. And if you lump all the neglected tropical diseases together, it's a little over 500,000 people. So millions of people infected, low mortality, which means a lot of misery. This is an illustration of a person in a low-income setting. I want you to notice the lumps and bumps on his body. That's due to lymphatic filariasis. I wouldn't be surprised if he has tuberculosis, as well as other infestations. Usually people have a number of these things. And he's part of a vicious cycle. Poverty promotes neglected tropical diseases. His shelter is horrendous. He probably lives, many people crowded together so they can give each other measles and tuberculosis. It's easy for insects and other vectors to come in and out of his hut. He has flooring, probably is dirt, so he can probably get leprosy if he was walking barefoot, which he is, and other things can come in through the roof. And of course, there's sewage issues, which means he can pass worms to each other and other things. Access to clean water is absent. He can tell he's malnourished if you look at his bones coming through his ribs coming through his skin, and that could either be due to the worms he has, or HIV, or the fact that he just isn't getting enough food, and he has probably no access to health care, or let alone medicines. The inverse is also true. The neglected tropical disease promote his poverty. In his family, he probably has increased infant mortality. His wives probably die. His children, if they survive the first few years, are impaired probably intellectually and physically, and therefore they have reduced productivity and are unable to pull themselves out of poverty. Now, as I said, with these NTDs, usually you just don't have one. You often have many. And if you actually look at the countries which have 5 or more, you'll see it's mostly the lower half of the world. That doesn't mean they don't exist up here, but they're not as prevalent. And with global warming and migration, we're beginning to see some in Europe and in the United States. There's an urgent need for diagnostics. We don't even know how efficiently to diagnose who really is infected and what stage of infection they have, let alone have good drugs to treat them. Most of these drugs are over 30 years old. And by the way, we're approved. For one condition, approximately 15% of people who will be treated will die because of a complication of the drug, but that's the only drug that's available. And there's an urgent need for vaccines. If you look at worldwide funding by all sources for these diseases, approximately $33 billion was spent last year for only about 20% of these diseases, and 73% of that went for the big three, which meant that only $750 million went for everything else. Now, why unlike the big three, why a neglected tropical disease is not being developed? Well, there's no or low return on investment. In many diseases, the poorest people in the poorest countries are the ones who are affected. So you're not going to get a return on investment. And most pharmaceutical companies don't focus on this because you can't survive developing a drug where you get no return. So that's led to what's called a product development partnership model, or public-private partnerships. And these are nonprofit organizations that use industry and business practices to develop new diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines. And they really fall into three camps. There's one called FIND, which is just down the road, which works on diagnostics. There's a variety of ones that work on drugs, as well as vaccines. And they've been somewhat successful. They'll partner with industry if the company agrees to allow intellectual property rights in endemic areas at a tiered pricing structure. And both Sanofi, Aventis, and Novartis have been successful in getting drugs approved, collaborating with these PDPs. Sanofi Aventis developed a drug for malaria, and Novartis developed it with DNDi, which is, it's a PDP down the road, and Novartis developed one with MMV, which is another one down the road. Geneva has a number of these PDPs. I just want to use MMV as an example. They get funding from governments, private foundations, international organizations, and private corporations. And they've been fairly successful in getting the money to do this. MMV is one of the richer PDPs. And the advantage of multiple sources of funding is they have independence and accountability. So one of the patient advocacy groups talked about the same thing. They're not in the pocket of anybody. And they also collaborate with the best people in the world, both preclinically and clinically. And so they're the place to go if you're interested in working on malaria. They'll get you the right people, and they'll even pay for initial screening to see if you have something. So they provide certain things which an industry would want. An industry provides other things. So they will give financial support for discovery. Once you have something with an IND, they'll actually pay for trials, and they'll get the right investigators involved, and they know they have target product profiles, and they also are very well linked to regulatory organizations. What the pharmaceutical company has is expertise, and together you can create a social business framework where basically drugs can be provided to the poor at a very low price, and yet allowing the company in a high and high middle income setting to sell it for a bigger profit, as well as developing that drug for something else. So for example, if we had developed a drug for leprosy with a PDP for leprosy, of which there is none, by the way, we would have allowed the drug to be used everywhere, but yet we would retain the right to use it for myeloma. This gives you an idea of their pipeline, and they actually got, MMV got a drug approved. Now the problem is that they tend to be under-resourced. They would love to do much more. Many of the PDPs are mostly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to the order of 60 or 70% of their funding. So they will often listen to them and their agenda. The manufacturing is often done with generics, and there have been issues. And the problem with clinical testing in resource-poor settings is you have to create the resource infrastructure for research, and that's been improving. But it's still, if you want to do a regulatory standard, you have to, it still costs $10,000 to $20,000 per person to study the patient, which means you're probably studying a patient. The cost of studying that patient is equal to 10 to 20 years of that person's income. There are intellectual property and generic issues, and there's a love-hate relationship with industry. It's been improving because more people in the industry are moving into these PDPs. There's a reluctance to bridge the valley of death, and someone else mentioned it, the idea of you get a hit, but to actually get something with an IND, which can then go into full development, has a very high attrition rate, and since they're accountable to many donors, they don't want to hear that the success rate of going from here to here is only about 10% or less. What's the desired product profile? It should be inexpensive, it should be oral, it should be once a day, it should be non-toxic, it should be robust, meaning it can survive high temperature and humidity settings sitting on a shelf somewhere. It should be highly effective, so you only have to give a few doses. It needs to be easy to use so people can understand it. You don't need to have an MD, PhD to understand it. And did I mention it has to be inexpensive? In fact, the price point for many drugs would be under 50 cents a day, or 53 cents a day. We formed our own division. We woke up one day and realized we were in the global health business. We just didn't know it because we were giving out free goods and we were also treating leprosy. But what we are doing now is we're using our resources to address DDWs, recognizing that there's little or no return on investment for these problems, that we have limited resources ourselves, but we do have a need for corporate social responsibility. And we do recognize if it works there, it could also work here, meaning that if we have a lead candidate, we'll also look at diseases for high-income, middle-income settings. Now, I'm not going to go through everything we did. I'll just state that we've been doing this now for approximately a little less than 3 years. There are two major foci. The one is the potential of our pipeline for treating DDW. We have immunomodulators. We also have 400,000 kinase inhibitors, which we're screening for a variety of diseases. And we're seeing activity in a variety of these diseases. And I'm sure in the future you'll hear more about that. We also are looking at models for access to medicines to treat people for non-communicable diseases in these poor settings. We believe that by developing a drug for a neglected tropical disease, we'll find a way to make money in a high-income setting, and that profit will pay for this activity. So the conclusion is very straightforward. We believe that it's no longer acceptable to ignore neglected tropical diseases, and that mechanisms exist to encourage neglected tropical disease development, and that companies should partner with these PDPs and other organizations that are dealing with this issue, and that companies that can afford to help should. And we recognize that many companies, including Celgene when I first joined it, could not afford to do it. But once we became profitable, you should not ignore it. And to use a phrase that was used earlier today, the patients are waiting, and there are a lot of them out there. So I want to thank you very much.